Welcome to A Spotlight On. For this episode, we have a spotlight on Darius and the experiences of young people and HIV around the world. So, Darius is a dedicated, enthusiastic activist working in the US and internationally. And through his community work and initiatives, he's committed to improving the lives and health of young Black boys and men, just to name a few. I have the privilege also of calling Darius my dear friend, and I have worked with him before. So, welcome, Darius. Hi.
Thank you so much. Hey to you. Hey to everyone out there watching. Super excited to be here.
Great stuff. Can you share a little bit about who you are and what you do for the people watching?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Darius. Folks call me DJ as well every now and then. So yeah, a little cool nickname there. I am a person living with HIV here in the U.S. Originally from the state of Florida. So if you're familiar with the country, it's the state where a lot of fun things happen, beaches and Disney World and things of that nature. I have been working in the field of HIV specifically since I was 21. I was looking for a place to support me as a Black queer man, a Black gay man, and once I moved away for or after I completed college or university, I was able to find a space that did that, and very soon after, started to engage in HIV prevention work and supporting people who are also living with HIV. And so now, so many years later, I am sitting in this space to talk to so many young people who might be having some challenges or wanting to figure out what does it look like to smile and be happy and walk around in a way that you're completely fulfilled.
That's beautiful. And I know you do such important work. So you were talking about now you're in this space, talking to young people about some of the challenges that they have, how to live their best lives. What would you say are some of the experiences of young people living with HIV in the US?
Yeah. So it really ranges a lot of times. Sometimes from the support system that you have, the ways in which you've understood HIV growing up. So here in the US, it is not uncommon to hear that folks have never even heard of HIV, but then have been diagnosed with HIV, right? Or haven't learned to prevent HIV. And then on other hands, some folks have been working to protect themselves for years and because they've learned about it at an early age. So many young people in the U.S. Sometimes go through a sexual health class in school, and that is where they first hear about HIV. But it's definitely not in a optimized, positive way. It's very don't have sex, don't do injection drugs, right? And so that becomes a little challenging. But in regards to the experience of folks living with HIV, medicine and health becomes complicated here in this country. We do have many programs that do support young people, especially. If any folks are familiar with Ryan White, we had a young man who was struggling with HIV. I think he was 15. And through that, he actually passed away. And that was kind of a standout moment for this country to say, hey, we have to do something about this. And so across the entire country, federally, we have a program called the Ryan White program. And what that means is that if you can't access your antiretrovirals, if you can't access care, and you meet a specific income threshold, then everything is provided for you free of cost, essentially. Um, there are some struggles within that. Things that are free in the US tend to also come with a lot of different um, drawbacks and barriers. And so it might mean you're driving 30 to 45 minutes. It might mean that your appointment that you want to schedule is not going to be until 2 or 3 months out, as opposed to folks who might have private insurance. And then we, of course, can jump into all of the stigma pieces. As a young person living with HIV in the country, um, no one's talking about it. No one's specifically saying, hey, I'm living with HIV at the age of 15 or at the age of 16 or 17. There are even folks as old as 30 who have struggles with that, right? And so I think stigma is a huge problem here. Um, I live in a pretty big metropolitan area, and spoke often about how there's not a face. Normally across this country, in bigger, larger cities, you'll see billboards of people from that space saying, "Hey, I'm living with HIV. If you are, visit this link." Um, we don't have that here in St. Louis. I currently live in St. Louis, Missouri, which is kind of smack dab in the middle of the U.S., but that doesn't exist here, and it's something that I've noticed, and I know that so much of that not existing here is stigma. And so, if you're a young person who grows up in this specific space or state, uh, you probably don't know that other people around you might be living with HIV, or that it's even okay to talk about it.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I can see a lot of similarities, but of course differences between the experiences that you're sharing about young people living with HIV between the US and the UK, and you talking about, the importance of young people, or people just generally knowing that there are other people living with HIV. That's one of the things that Chiva is aiming to do, reduce isolation, have communities come together. And it might be quite surprising for some of the viewers that are listening that actually in the US, some people, the healthcare system is very different. Here in the UK, medicine is free, and in the US, that's not the case. So it's just interesting to see those differences across different countries. But I know when you're talking about stigma, that will speak to a lot of young people in the UK and who are watching this right now, because it's something that kind of cuts across, unfortunately, no matter where we are in the world. One of the
Yeah,
things go for it.
no, it's all good. Yeah, no, I definitely, I just remember two things. One, when I first got my diagnosis, the immediate thought was, I'm on my deathbed, right? Like, my life is going to end. I was 21 years old when I got my status delivery, and it was immediately, there's no way I can live. And so, yeah, that stigma is definitely very strong. And oddly enough, my first thought was whether or not I'd be able to have kids. Which is very interesting, just given that, I am a queer man, and, to have biologically having kids with a woman was not going to be a thing. And so that was very interesting. But I will say, in terms of that isolation piece, the first time I actually came out about my status was in a room full of young people, because I saw so many people stand up and say, my name is such and such. I'm 22 and I'm living with HIV. My name is such and such. I'm such. And what was powerful about it was, it was a national conference, the United States Conference on AIDS. And I never had stood up. I'd never said it out loud to anyone beyond my best friend or my mom. And so to be able to see a room full of young people stand up and talk about their status, and very vulnerably and honestly, I definitely was in tears when I was saying it, because it was just such a powerful moment to see so many people just like me saying, "Hey, I'm here and I'm living with HIV." So I wanted to talk to that a little bit, because that sparked that memory for me.
And how was that for you? Like, did you know that you were going to do it beforehand, or was it in the moment?
And here's the thing, though. What was weird is the conference, United States Conference on AIDS, the program that I was in was a youth fellowship program for young people living with HIV, right? And so it was clearly obvious that, everybody in the room is living with HIV, but I didn't see myself standing up and saying it. Even in that room, and I think what's interesting about the way stigma works is that even in that room, I still felt, no, don't tell these people, right? And it's like, wait, they already know. What are you talking about? And so it still was a very powerful thing for me to stand up in that space and say, and I've been living with HIV for X amount of months or years. And I will say, one of the coolest things that came out of that was, after that moment, was when I told my mom. It opened up the door for me to actually have a conversation with my mother after 3 years and say, hey, we need to talk. It was well received. I think part of that was because I was in good health.
Mm-hmm.
But then my mom is also a nurse. And so I think that played a lot into just her understanding the virus as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's good that you were able to talk to your mum about that. If there are, I know that one of the things that crosses the minds of a lot of young people that we work with, the majority of them were born with HIV, but one thing that crosses their mind is just talking to other people about HIV. But are there any tips that you would have, or things that you think that they should think about if they are planning on talking to a partner, talking to their parents, friends, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of operate on a, if I'm having this conversation, is it to benefit the world? It's not something that I don't think needs to come up all the time. And I'm not from the boat of, I think some people say, one time I had an experience with a nurse who I told her, I wasn't going in for HIV related services. And she had to draw some blood for me. And I said, oh, it's fine. I'm used to needles. And she said, oh, why is that? And I said, well, I'm living with HIV. I have to get my blood drawn every 6 months. And she said, oh, okay, cool. But you don't have to tell everybody you're living with HIV. And I'm just like, I don't mind sharing that with you, nurse, right? And so I'm not of the camp of you don't have to tell anybody to kind of contribute to stigma. I think some people, when they say that, it's a stigmatized thing. But when I talk about not telling everyone, it's, I'm putting this into the atmosphere just like you would anything else, right? I used to be an educator, and I wouldn't bring that up unless I was talking about education, right? I wouldn't just randomly say I used to be a teacher, or even if I used to have a low cut. You all can't see my hair, but if my hair used to be shaved and faded, I wouldn't randomly tell someone that if like they didn't need that information. And so I think about HIV the same way. It's an identity that I hold, and if it comes up in conversation, I don't mind sharing it. I think in terms of tips, it really revolves around if someone is ready to hear it, what's their level of education around it. I'm realizing more and more that plays such a huge role in how people receive what you're telling them. I think the other real thing is that many people do still see HIV as a death wish, or as something that, is going to impact your life in a very, very, very negative way. And that you can never be happy, or positive, no pun intended, but that there's no positivity around it. And so what does happen, and if I don't know if young folks in this space have done any thinking around trauma and survive and what survival mode means from a standpoint of flight, fight, or freeze. But the reality of it is that if you're telling a loved one that you're living with HIV and they do have hold that stigma of negativity, they're immediately going into that survival mode for you, because they are thinking, wait, what does that mean for you as a human being in my life, right? And sometimes they might freeze, right? Sometimes they might fight back and say, wait, why didn't you tell me? How did this happen? Yada, yada, yada. And then in some cases might not talk to you for a couple of days, right? They need to figure it out. And that's really hard to deal with. And so I would say if you're ever getting to the point of sharing that information, have someone like right there in your corner who you can call, depending on how that situation goes. That's going to be the most important. I think that also be okay with being emotional. The very first time I talked to someone about my status, I just sat on the phone with them crying for 2 to 3 hours. That's all I did. I think after the first hour, I finally actually said, I'm living with HIV. But they were very patient and just waited on the phone with me before I kind of started having that conversation. And so a lot of times I get it. We're trying to hold that strong armor on us. And I think we continue to grow that strong armor, but there are also days that are hard and difficult. And so being okay to sit back and let that tear fall, so that you can start, like, I think the better question, not better question, but I think a second follow-up question, right, is, are you okay with your status, right? Are you okay talking to yourself about your status? Because that can be hard, right? So maybe a challenge for folks might be stand in front of the mirror first and say it out loud. See how that feels to you and how you experience that, right? So you can make sure that you're in a place of like solidarity with yourself, before you start to, share that with others.
So many important points, and I would say that was a better question. No, but I loved that you were talking about allowing yourself to be emotional. I think that's a very important message, and I'm also really glad that the person that you did tell had that patience, and gave the space and the time to that conversation, and how comfortable you were with sharing when you shared. So that's really beautiful to hear. And I think it's really good how you were talking through the different responses that a person, a loved one might have, and especially with the analogies that you gave. And just a reminder as well that some people will be informed and their reaction actually might be positive, like immediately, but it is good, as you've said, to kind of consider the different responses that you might have, and having that person in your corner and feeling already centered in yourself about your own HIV status, I think is crucial information. So thank you so much for bringing that up. The next question that I have for you is, what are your hopes for young people living with HIV? Now, that can be generally or very specifically. You have already got an answer in your head. I can see it. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, my immediate answer is like, that's a lot. No, but I think, I think so often, you know, right now I've seen circulating on social media by young people is, would you date someone who's HIV positive? And I'm just like, what? You know, what does that do to people's psyches and emotional states, that people are just openly like debating on whether or not to date you? Um, for young people across the globe, and you're right, like this could be a very general conversation, a very specific. Sorry, there's a huge truck driving by. um, the first thing is kind of what I just finished off in that last statement, is like just being centered in your status and who you are. I think so many of the challenges that we run into, the first challenges that we run into is that we're carrying this heavy, heavy burden on our shoulders. And so I know when I first was diagnosed, anytime I walked around, when I saw my reflection, I asked myself, can they see it on me? And that was hard, right? Everywhere you go, you're wondering, can they see it on you? And if you're watching this, you know the answer to that question is normally no, right? Unless like someone's in your house and sees your medication or sees a transcript of your doctor's appointment, right? Like no one knows that you're living with HIV, right? And so I think for me, it's really a level of making sure the world is setting us up to just be great, right? To live our best lives, as we kind of started off in the beginning of this conversation. And what that means is that, one, that like I know that I can say I'm living with HIV and it has no impact negatively on anyone in the world, right? Like it's just a statement. Again, if you were to walk in the room and say I like going to school or I went to this university, like it's just a statement. And it does come with a lot of meaning, right? And so I don't want to water it down to it just being a statement, because it's an identity that I hold. I have unique experiences as a Black queer man living with HIV, right? And so I don't want to water it down in that way, but uh, I want folks to have the power to name that too. When I talk and share my status, like I said, it's to benefit the world, right? I see it that way. If I'm sharing my information with you, I want you to gain something from it. Even the nurse I talked about earlier who tried to shut me down, I was normalizing HIV, right? You're a nurse. There are people you're gonna serve sometimes that are living with HIV, and I want you to know that even though you're doing this work, it was actually a tuberculosis test, which is even more interesting because those two things can exist in the same time for young people. But I wanted her to understand that, like, hey, like this is a thing that happens and a thing you'll come across. And so I want us to know that our status is not something that is a dagger to folks. It shouldn't be a dagger to us. It should be something that we are saying, this is an identity I hold and I'm proud of it. And I'm working through some things as well. And I want you to know what that looks like and feels like. And sometimes there is pain. And sometimes there's happiness and joy. And I mean, even on this call, to see so much smiling, right? If you just, I wonder if you played this without sound to someone and they saw us just engaging in such pure happiness, if they would know that we're talking about living with HIV, right? I want that to be the experience of every young person. Maybe can we like recoin like living with HIV to smiling with HIV? Can we start
Smiling
that?
with HIV, we can do that. Smiling with HIV, love it. That was beautiful. Thank you, Darius. Final question. So every camp has a theme,
Ooh.
and this theme, I know, right? And this theme is superheroes. So, final question for you is, who is a superhero to you and why?
It's so funny. Well, my immediate thought went to Black Panther. Yes, Wakanda.
Wakanda forever.
Immediate thought. There are a couple people though, both living and non-living. One of which is Bayard Rustin, who I'm looking at right now, who are current. I'm in our community space right now. Um, And Bayard Rustin was a community rights activist who was both Black and queer. And he actually marched alongside Martin Luther King, John Lewis, who unfortunately just passed. Well, I wouldn't even say unfortunately. I think he lived a beautiful, amazing life out here in these streets. But Bayard Rustin was often silenced. He single-handedly organized one of the greatest marches here, the March on Washington, if anyone is familiar with that. And he was a Black queer man, and no one talked about that. And once I found his story, it changed my life to understand my power and how I can navigate the world. If you can, I think he has a documentary called Brother Outsider. It's an amazing documentary. And then I'll also have to say my great grandmother, who's always pushed. She's the reason I'm in this work. When I was 7 years old, I was at the office with her. She was the president of her neighborhood association, making changes to the way in which people lived, advocating for people like me outside every day. And that meant a lot. And then finally, my current boss, who I call my dad, he is the owner, the CEO of the place that I work at, which we're a not public health nonprofit that focuses on minorities, so Black and brown people specifically. And he's a Black queer man, and I didn't know it was possible to be successful and support your people in the way in which he is doing that. And it's really opened my eyes to, like I said, I was looking for a space when I first moved here, and trying to figure out who I was as a Black queer man. And 8 years later, I am working for that space and creating systems and structures to better the lives of other Black queer men who walk through the door with the team full of Black queer men, right? Uh, he's had such an influence on my life in thinking about how we do this work. About 15 to 20 years ago, the city of St. Louis cut funding specifically for Black bodies as it related to HIV. And he said, nope. And so he literally took a chain and a padlock and chained himself to the city hall and said, I'm not leaving until you all give us funding. And so those are moments that we need. Those are people that we need. And so those three people by far are the people that have influenced me and pushed me to be where I am now.
That's incredible. And it really shows the importance of representation, seeing people who look like you, being able to connect, on an emotional and spiritual level, and knowing that you matter. And I know even through a screen, everyone watching is just, they're definitely going to be able to feel your energy and your positivity and your
Sure.
smiling positivity.
All the smiles, all day.
All the smiles. Darius, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your energy, for all that you do and for what you've shared with us today.
For sure. Thank you to you and everyone. And I think for young people, just continue remembering that you matter and you have power. So often we're stripped of that, and you need to know you matter and you have power. So go off and be great and live your best life.
Thank you.
No problem.